Hello. My name is Mike Lambert. I'm director of the African Studies Center at UNC, and I am here to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Shomarka Keita is a physician and biological anthropologist affiliated with Howard University, the Smithsonian Institution, and Linacre College, Oxford. Dr. Keita serves as a medical officer at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was educated at Williams College, the American University in Cairo, Howard University College of Medicine, and Oxford University. His publications, as first or co-authored, have appeared in a variety of journals, including American Anthropologist, Science, Nature, the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, Human Biology, the American Journal of Human Biology, History in Africa, the Journal of Black Studies, and Gene Watch. His interests are broad and include, among others, the policy implications of human biological changes related to socioeconomic disadvantage, the skeletal biology of ancient African societies, the use of genetics in historical questions, the colonial roots of history and anthropology of Africa, how ideas about human variation are conceptualized, in particular through the term race, bias in science, and ethics of curiosity. Most importantly, through his work, Dr. Keita has forced us to critically interrogate and question our use of the concept of race, particularly as it relates to African history and the ways in which we understand the populations and even the geography of the African continent. Today, Dr. Keita will touch on these and other topics in his discussion of evolution and levels of history in African biocultural diversity. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Shomarka Keita.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for having me, and I would like to greet the ambassadors and their staff from the various countries that have come to be in our presence. I want to say up front some things just to make some points so that if I run out of time, I will have said them. Behind you, witness the gallery of African diversity. It's sort of representative. I don't claim that it's absolutely complete, but you see a lot of different faces, a lot of different physiognomies, a lot of different skin colors. And I'm going to be commenting on those things, how they've been conceptualized and their sources. What I want to say is that Africa is not monolithic. There's no one way to be an African. You can describe the African reality in terms of biology, but you cannot define it. Social, cultural, and past ideas from the past, political ideas have influenced the interpretation in science, and that includes the conceptualization of Africa. A critical approach is needed, critical scientific approach. Y chromosome genealogies, which I'm going to use as a kind of scaffolding, show the interconnections of the different African regions. Both evolution and history explain biological diversity of what I call endogenous Africans. And we can talk about why I say endogenous and not indigenous. Racial thinking obscures the connections between peoples and is non-evolutionary, ahistorical, and is something that we can do away with. It still lurks beneath a lot of commentary even when the term race is not used. Please forgive me if I'm redundant on some things. I'm going to start by reading something from Nelson Mandela read in 1994. Oh, thank you. In 1994, after he had been out of prison, and his address to the Organization of African Unity. And I also want to say I want to recognize a friend of mine, Dr. Tori Dickinson, who was a student of Emanuel Wallerstein, who contributed a lot to the study of Africa. She's here. You should speak with her. Nelson Mandela said in 1994 in Tunisia, the 13th of June, Mr. Chairman, distinguished heads of state, and others, in the distant days of antiquity, a Roman sentenced this African city to death. Carthage must be destroyed. Carthago delenda est. And Carthage was destroyed. Today we wander among its ruins. Only our imagination and historical records enable us to experience its magnificence. Only our African being makes it possible for us to hear the piteous cries of the victims of the vengeance of the Roman Empire. And yet we can say this, that all human civilization rests on foundations such as the ruins of the African city of Carthage. These architectural remains, like the pyramids of Egypt, the sculptures of the ancient kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Benin, like the temples of Ethiopia, the Zimbabwe ruins, and the rock paintings of the Galagadi and Namib deserts, all speak of Africa's contribution to the formation and the condition of civilization. But in the end, Carthage was destroyed. During the long interregnum, the children of Africa were carted away as slaves. Our lands became the property of other nations. Our resources a source of enrichment for other peoples, and our kings and queens mere servants of foreign powers. In the end, we were held out as the outstanding example of the beneficiaries of charity because we became the permanent victims of famine, of destructive conflicts, and of the pestilence of the natural world. On our knees, because history, society, and nature had defeated us, we could be nothing but beggars. What the Romans had sought with the destruction of Carthage had indeed become true. But the ancient pride of the peoples of our continent asserted itself and gave us hope in the form of giants such as Queen Regent Labat Sebene of Swaziland, Mohammed V of Morocco, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Murtala Muhammad of Nigeria, Prince Patrice Lumumba of Zaire, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, Agostinho Neto of Angola, Eduardo Mondlane and Samora Machel of Mozambique, Seretse Khama of Botswana, W.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King of America, Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, Albert Luthuli and Oliver Tambo of South Africa. The African world is a large place, and we have to ask ourselves one question in terms of its people. So Jean Ernaud in 1974 says, in sub-Saharan Africa, many anthropological characters show a wide range of variation. Population means and frequencies. In some of them, the whole of the world range is covered in the subcontinent. Here live the shortest and the tallest human populations, the one with the highest and the one with the lowest nose, the one with the thickest and the one with the thinnest lips in the world. In this area, the range of average nose widths covers 92% of the world range. Only a narrow range of extremely low means are absent from the African record. Means for head diameters cover about 80% of the world range. 60% is the corresponding value for a variable once cherished by physical anthropologists, namely the cephalic index. And he goes on to talk about serological traits that also are highly variable, aspects of fingerprints that are highly variable. These are the classical traits that anthropologists used at one time. Some still do. Of course, now we have DNA, and DNA diversity is also known to be extremely great in Africa. He asked the following questions, though. He says, confronted with such a wide variation in biological characters in the native populations of sub-Saharan Africa, and to be frank with the stereotyped idea that most of us have about what a true African looks like, one is inclined to ask whether all of this diversity originated in sub-Saharan Africa. If not, how much of it was the result of gene flow, that is to say admixture or migration into the area, and where did it come from? We can extend his commentary on sub-Saharan Africa to all of Africa, because although Ernaud's major thesis of his book, that is to say, to argue for an evolutionary explanation of African diversity, is well done for tropical Africa, he too falls prey at some level to excluding Northern Africa, or what I call supra-Saharan Africa. And I hope to show you the interconnections between peoples today using the Y chromosome as a scaffolding. A part of the problem has been that Africa had been divided into, for lack of better words, a white and a black region by early writers and the European colonialists and writers and scientists and others. And this legacy still persists, although not in its most overt forms. What is ironical about this is that for those Romans, Tunisia, Carthage, was Africa. They restricted the term Africa to that part of the continent. They had some other names, maybe the Greeks did, for regions beyond Egypt, which I will not discuss, but Tunisia was Africa. And when, in the Muslim era, when Arabic-speaking Muslims came into northern Africa, they carried on this tradition of calling what we now call Tunisia and the surrounding areas Ifriqiya. And that name was only lost with the rise of the Ottomans, who gave it the name that it has today, Tunisia. So knowing a little history makes a difference in some regards, because it was with the rise of the more recent European, quote, exploration that Africa, the term gets applied to the whole continent. And it is, of course, ironic that today in public discourse, when we hear about Tunisia or Libya or Egypt, we hear that they are in the Middle East, depending on, what the particular problem is going on. And if you're talking about oil, sometimes Libya is in Africa. If you're talking about bad rulers and revolutionaries, it's in the Middle East. So it really depends on the socio-political context. I'm not interested in that. And I'm not really interested in certain kinds of personal identities that may be based on reality, or let's say I'm not interested in social identities. Today we're going to be talking about a kind of biogeography. Because of this, President Mandela's comments would be seen as wrong in some quarters. This historically has to do with the ideas that still get reflected in policy, as I've noted. And I've already talked about the fact that the Romans addressed this part of Africa in its own particular way. I would like to say that I don't believe that anyone in this room, or that in general today, that the kinds of colonialist thinking that led to the injection of Africans with live pathogens in the 1950s and that were published would go on today. I would like to think that that kind of arrogance and assumption that people could be mistreated based on ideology and a perception that they are not equals would not go on. But it did go on in the past. And I'm sure that some of you may be aware of some of the studies that I'm alluding to. However, I have to say that we have to be concerned, nevertheless, with the ethics of curiosity. And what do I mean by that? You can talk about that very simply in terms of one simple question. Who gives you the right to have my DNA? I mean, if I wanted to go into a village in Sweden and say, hey, I want your DNA, people might think, well, wait a minute, who are you and where'd you come from and why? So I don't think we discuss enough the ethics of curiosity. And I don't think that when it comes to informed consent that we have a very critical approach with regard to integrating the sins of the past, so to speak. And so I would say that these are things that need to be discussed. Now on to the main topic here. Biology in this form, in the form that we're going to talk about when we talk about diversification, is a form of history. I mean, biology in some sense, as Stephen Gould said, it's a form of a historical discipline. You can talk about evolutionary biology, etc. Systems change over time and what have you. But historians talk about the kinds of errors that they could make. I mean, historians of the regular sort. And they talk about how there can be a misinterpretation of evidence, little justification in asserting presented inferences. Another problem is that one can present an unfair, unbalanced account which might be credible, but omits significant facts, so the sin of omission. Another problem is the presentation of a general description that implies facts that on available evidence are known to be false. This often happens when we have a particular theoretical bias. So for the Marxists, for example, everything is class conflict. So even if there are no classes, you have to find them in order to talk the way you talk. And I'm sure you can think of many other circumstances where people have invented things in order to act, like those weapons of mass destruction that we found in Iraq. Okay. The other thing is that, the last thing is that a problem in terms of historical work is providing some but not all of the important causes when you're trying to provide a causal explanation. Okay. These defects in inference, description, and explanation can be accidental, but there can also be deliberate bias. And there are two kinds of bias that we're interested in. Personal bias, where an individual has a particular agenda and a particular outcome is desired, and also cultural bias, where an inherited background of information and just assumptions about the world influence the way we think and the way we work. This is harder to get rid of. And no matter who you are, it's amazing how you can find yourself repeating things that simply don't make sense for you or for the issue at hand. This is an Amazigh woman from Morocco. This is another Berber-speaking woman, Tuareg in this case. This is a woman from Nubia, northern Sudan. This is a woman from Nigeria. You'll notice certain terminology. These are all Africans, and I'm not going to say any more about that unless I have some time. Now, I need that person to help me switch over, excuse me, to the other presentation. Thank you. Okay, so how can I move it? Okay. All right, thank you. All right. So I've given you some core underpinnings of what I want to do, and I hope that it hasn't led to this reaction that, you know, this was my son at about 2 months last year. We know that Africa is large. It has many ecosystems, and just sheer size and sheer length of time have been very important. But I want to bring to your attention this issue about diversity. I read to you something from Jean Ernaud from 1974, very important book, The People of Africa. But this is from a book written in the 1850s. What is called the Negro type, that is, the low type off the coast of Guinea, is comparatively the exception, perhaps as much so as the low Irish type in the Celtic race. There are jet black Negroes with woolly hair, but noble Aryan features, or black people with frizzled and even straight hair and regular features, or blacks with flowing hair and ringlets, or light brown people with woolly hair and European forms and face, or light brown with Negro features, or brown with the lowest Negro type and hair and tufts. We can ignore this word low, you know, but they're talking about extreme traits. Peschel, a German natural historian, 1888, writes, in some tribes, the nose is pointed, straight, or hooked. Grecian profiles are spoken of, and travelers say with surprise that they cannot perceive anything of the so-called Negro type among the Negroes. I give you these quotes and give you this conversation because what it tells you is that European travelers, at least some European scientists, were aware of this diversity in Africa. What happened subsequently is an idea that somehow the real African, the true African, as Ernaud talks about, would be confined to that morphology called by Gabriel Seligman the true Negro type. And if you remember the slides that I just showed you, you saw people with different faces, and you can imagine the notion of people having an idea about the pure African or the real African. And it was assumed that all of the other Africans were not really from Africa, or that they had been admixed with other people coming in. This is a part of something called the Hamitic hypothesis that Professor Ehret mentioned. The Hamites were said to have come from Africa, from the Near East, and they were said to have brought a different physique, a different physiognomy, a different language, what we would now call Afro-Asiatic, and that they brought a superior culture, which in this case was regarded as pastoralism, and they did actually seed the invention of ground agriculture to the local Negroes, which is interesting because later on in terms of culture history, the idea that pastoralism would be ranked above that becomes reversed. But my point here is to talk about human biological diversity. So I asked, well, where does all this diversity come from, and what tells you if it's connected? This vase is a Janus head from ancient Greece. What this Greek artist is doing is showing you the most extreme kind of African, perhaps that he knows, because he's making a nice vase to contrast people. This isn't racist or anything. He's illustrating what he knows. He says, I know about people who are different. And so he's contrasting the profile of the Greek versus, or the Macedonian versus some of the Africans that he has seen. But of course, there are Africans with black skin and flat noses who don't have what's the projection of the lower face, which is called prognathism, which some anthropologists used to use as the sine qua non of Africanity. So let's talk about evolution. We've heard a great talk. I don't have to say a lot about that. Modern humans have been in Africa between 100 and 200,000 years. You pick your number, large standard error. Fossils and genetic data indicate this modern emergence. I think we have to think in terms of emergence theory. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There may be different things that have gone into the mix, but the modernity has emerged on African soil, as Chris Stringer has said. It's been a long time for diversification before and after modern's leaving, and that's important. When did modern people leave Africa? Some people say 40,000 years. Some people say 60,000 years. Whatever it is, there's a huge amount of time between the emergence of modern Africans and when they leave. Enough time to have accumulated all kinds of mutations and potentials for variation. Adaptive selection, gene exchange, genetic drift, social selection have been able to act on this variability. I will not discuss all of these in detail now, but please feel free to ask questions later. So we have at the end of this, by the time we get to the last 10,000 years, which is really the topic of what we're looking at, what we're sampling in a way now, the emergence of Holocene biocultural Africanity. This illustrates the notion of serial founder effect, but it also can be used to illustrate something else, kin-structured migration. So you have a big pool of people, some break off, and then some break off of the subsequent groups. The overlapping circles tell you that you should always expect that there will be some common ancestors for all the subsequent groups. So you should not be surprised. There are people in Africa who are more like some people outside of Africa at the autosomal level, or maybe even at the skin color level. So there's no a priori reason why one would think that the people that I showed you, some of the very fair-skinned, straight-haired people, are not Africans. There's no scientific reason for believing that. Now, that's a separate question from the historical question of, do we know that such people come later, or have they been coming, ebbing and flowing a long time? Separate question. One's a theoretical issue, and the other one is the historical question. I said I would use the Y chromosome as scaffolding because it's frankly easy to talk about. Let me just say that. If you look at this phylogeny, this is like a family tree, a genealogy. You see that A and B is essentially confined to Africa, and that the E haplogroup and its underived YAP marker are in Africa, and as well as the underived YAP marker being outside. The YAP marker is very interesting for the following reason in terms of our thinking. For those people that think that identities or phenotypes, physical complexes, all line up with particular lineages, the Y chromosome genealogy shatters all of that, because on any of these lineages, you can find individual males. This is the non-recombining part of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome genealogy shatters the myth that there are coherent lineages related to phenotype. So let's look at haplogroup A, for example. You find it scattered all around Africa. It's recently been revised, the deep-rooting clade, so this tree is not the correct one anymore. So you find people in Morocco who look like the Berbers that I showed you. You find Shilluk in the Sudan. You find people in Central Africa, the Batwa people, all having, I didn't say high frequency, but you can find percentages that have A, the same for B. The E haplogroup, though, is the major haplogroup in Africa, and it basically explains variation all over the continent. The E haplogroup is defined by the M96 mutation, and I will show you how it breaks down in a moment. No, not that. Okay. This is the E haplogroup. I want you to look at the place where it says 2, or look at the P2. What's important here is to understand that the P2, the PN2 transition, is a marker that explains or ties most African males together. It doesn't matter how they look. If they are blonde-eyed, blonde-haired Berbers, or they are blue-black Shilluk, or they are people from South Africa. The P2 transition gave rise to two sons, so to speak. The M2, which is the one you see on the left with the submarkers, and the M35. The M35 is found in an arc from Ethiopia up through Egypt over to Morocco. Frequencies range from 48 to 90%. Some of the very same Berber groups that you see who look like, quote unquote, look like Europeans, in some communities they have 90% of the PN2 M3581. The mitochondrial, the female lineages, though, are much more complex in North Africa. A lot of, quote, sex-biased migration. It's on a coastal area. There's been a lot of interaction over the last, I would say, 5,000 years, or maybe even more. And so that should not be surprising. What's interesting, though, is that Berber languages, and ancient Egyptian for that matter, are not creoles. They are not languages like the Haitian patois, born of very serious contact. The people who came into northern Africa, either in singlets or in small numbers from different places, were totally absorbed into a language family that emerged in Africa and into those communities. Now, some people have, well, let me just say it now. There was no demic diffusion of the Neolithic into Africa from the Near East. There was no demic diffusion, there was no transfer of the language that's spoken in northern Africa. Afroasiatic is the language that's spoken in that part of Africa as the language family. Reconstructions of Proto-Afroasiatic show that it was spoken by hunters and gatherers, not agriculturalists. Agriculture, cereal agriculture, emerges in the Near East about 2,000 years before we find it in northern Egypt. If there had been simple demic diffusion, not only would the archaeological picture look differently, but we would expect that in ancient Egyptian there would be loan words for particular plants, particular animals, particular practices. There are not. And Egyptian and Semitic are not the same languages. Even when you go to the Berber languages, the words for those things, for the most part, indicate a local origin. There's no question that the sheep and the goat that were domesticated in the Near East came into Africa from the Near East. Cattle were domesticated in Africa and in the Near East, and there's linguistic and other evidence for that. But the bottom line, if I run out of time right now, is to understand the PN2, M2 lineages are found primarily in tropical Africa, and the PN2, M35 lineages are found in an arc from East Africa up over to Morocco. And in the Sahara, you have all kinds of mixtures. I'm going to show you an interesting historical irony, though, in a moment. In this particular chart, and this has been revised, the PN2 transition is given a date of about 28,000 years, and you can see this here. So you say, well, that's a long time ago. Again, I'm talking about genealogy and a concept of interconnectedness. I'm not talking about overall genetic similarity, which, based on a serial founder effect and other things, I would not necessarily to be necessarily close anyway. It's all history. Just different time depths and processes, levels of bioethnic history, levels and interactions and layers within levels. Biogenesis interacts with ethnogenesis. A culturally defined group can change biology, meaning accept other people into it unless the rules don't allow it, and a biologically defined group, which is what we would do, can change culture. The legacy African Americans, the people who came here in the Middle Passage, speak English. None of us have any, in North America, no African languages were retained. A little bit different in Cuba and Brazil. But also, from a social political point of view, the legacy African American is a hybrid or a mixture of many different things based on descent rules. Okay? I just use that. It's not the best example, but it works. Okay. Now, here's some deep time history. This is a language map of Africa. You see Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Kordofanian in blue, purple, and the Khoisan languages. They've included the settled languages from the Indo-Europeans and the Austronesian languages in Madagascar as well. This is a map showing the sites and the radiocarbon dates for the spread of pastoralism, or the adoption of pastoralism. You know, we have to be careful about words and categorical thinking. We find early cattle in Marimba. We find also donkey remains, which donkey is an African animal, the Fayum. The importance of this slide is to think in terms of those previous language families and how they may have interacted there, as well as the later societies that would emerge. In the case of Afro-Asiatic, we see a cradle in Northeast Africa, fissioning and dividing, and eventually with the outlier language Semitic going into the Middle East, or its parent, and then coming back into Africa by coming into Ethiopia. In that case, there were real migrants involved, and we can tell that with DNA. But I can also say, and I should say it, that the modern day Egyptians, for the most part, when you look at all of this data in the literature, the males are more than 50%, more than 60% of the PN2 N35. And the Berbers, more than 60, 70% of the PN2 M35/81. In the Egyptian cases, M35, 38, 78. The Somalis is M35, 78. Are there exceptions? Yes. And this is where understanding historical processes and cultural habits are important. In the Sahel, you have pastoralists who change identities based on the fortune of their herds. They may absorb other people. Some people absorbing certain people are prestigious. So, for example, if you are Fulani, Muslim, and you are traveling across the Sahel and the Sahara, with your cattle over a 10, 15-year period, you could run into some of the Baggara Arabs. You know about this fight in Darfur, this struggle in Darfur. But if they lose their cattle, those Baggara Arabs may join your group, and over a generation they may become Fulani. So you have now gotten some different male lineages from a different place. The reverse happens as well. If you look at the Baggara Arabs in the Sudan, in Darfur, phenotypically they are almost indistinguishable, usually but not always, from the other people, the Fur, the other people. But their Y chromosome lineages are M89, which is what you find in the Near East amongst Semitic speakers. So here's the clear evidence of of Arab tribes, Arab peoples coming in to Africa and occupying the ecological niche of the Sahara. We'll talk about that maybe in a second. Now, African societies in the Peri-Common era. Notice here that we have a map, very bad map, but showing the expansion of Bantu languages. We have in northern Africa, we have this Carthage and the various ethnic groups known by the literature of the time from the Romans and the Greeks, the Gatulis, the Garmantes. Of course, we have late Egypt at that time. The arrows coming from the pink going to the center, suggestion of Nubian Christianity. There are churches that have been found around the Lake Chad area, okay? I mention this because some people say, and I was pleased that Dr. Tishkoff did not say, people will say that the PN2M2 lineage represents the expansion of the Bantu sub-branch of Niger-Congo. True enough, many of them had this lineage, but the actual lineage itself is older. If you think back to that chart that I showed you, the PN2, the M2 mutation downstream from PN2 is about 18,000 years old. And that 18,000 years is much older than any Bantu language. Here we have African kingdoms at a later period in time. This map still shows you Carthage in the late period. It shows you that this is clearly the later phase of classical Egypt. You have the Kush kingdom, but you also have, at a later date, the emergence of the nation societies that would lead to the Lunda and the Luba kingdoms in Central Africa, and you have the states of West Africa and the Sahel Belt. You say, well, why is this important? It's important because complex societies have an impact on the genetic makeup of people. In complex societies, people behave differently. They assimilate people differently. For example, Ibn Battuta tells us that when Mansa Musa, king of Mali in the early 1300s, went to Mecca, that he and some of his entourage bought, it's the only way I can say it, concubines in the slave market in Cairo. And some of these concubines would have been from Eurasia. At a much later date, there was someone trying to run away from the king of Morocco, and he went to a kingdom that's not listed here, the Moshi kingdom, Yatenga, in what is now Mali. And what was the price of admission? What did the Moshi king ask him for? 2 Andalusian virgins. Okay? So, understanding how history can impact on genetics is just as important as the big science explanation of adaptation, evolution, and sometimes the assumptions that we make. You know, sometimes the assumptions, the deep time, well, this must have happened this way. Well, no, sometimes opening some books from a little bit different field will help us out. Now, this is this map reproduces the Middle Age kingdoms from West Africa, but it also has the Islamic world in Northern Africa. So we have the Umayyad Caliphate, which spread into Northern Africa, into Spain, in the early part of the era of the Islamic period. It was succeeded by the Fatimids, who in turn succeeded by the, well, actually the Umayyads were succeeded by the Abbasids, who were then succeeded by the Fatimids, and then the Ayyubids. You say, well, gee, is that important? Well, yeah, it's important. The Fatimids arose amongst the Berbers in central Algeria. They were very egalitarian. They were Shiites. They had an army that was ethnically structured. So, if you have contingents of troops that are Nubians or people from the Central Sahara who are, quote, black, and you have Turks and you have this and you have that, suppose you settle these people around an oasis and they have lots of children there. Then the geneticist comes along 2,000 years later, well, not quite, 1,500 years later, and they generate some story about why they find particular haplotypes or genotypes. And of course, the easiest thing to say is what? The trans-Saharan slave trade. But how do you know that the Fatimids did not settle a group of Nubian or other troops in place X? You don't know. You don't want to commit that historical error of leaving out all of the possible causes. Okay. Now, we see here on this map also the Kingdom of Aksum, Christian kingdom, very important place even in terms of the history of Islam, because the early Muslim community was sent there to be protected. In the early Muslim armies, there were all kinds of people. The idea that they were all people that looked like President Assad of Syria now is simply wrong. That too is a historical fact that might help us discuss certain kinds of issues. Even when it comes to Saharan Jews, you sometimes find markers that are there that are, quote, sub-Saharan, you know, instead of super-Saharan, or sometimes you find Berber markers there. Well, there were Judaicized Berbers, but there were also situations where, unfortunately, there were pogroms against Jews in Saharan oases. Men were killed. What did the women do? I think that some of the women converted some of their servants/slaves to Judaism and married them in order to have men in the house. Because, you know, I don't know that, but I've talked to rabbis about that, and they say, well, yeah, that could have happened. There's nothing in Jewish law that says you couldn't do that. Okay? Here we have, all of these maps show the Sahel Belt kingdoms. This one figures Bornu in the center in the orange. The Bornu kingdom was basically, unfortunately, a slave state. The Bulala, I mean, they made their money trading in slaves. They actually had relations with the Ottomans, and we have literature that speaks to that diplomatic relationship. You see here to your right the Christian kingdoms in Nubia. The Nubians were Christians until the 14th century, after which they became Muslims, and then, of course, later they became Arabized, but until that point, they were very powerful. The treaties had to be made with them. Again, complex societies tend to be more genetically complex. Ethnic identities get blended. The idea of a primordial Africa with people gyrating in corners, isolated, is simply wrong. Even in a place like Darfur, the people are actually, they're committing fratricide. They're actually related. Here's an interesting situation and an interesting irony. The Chadic language family is one of the coordinate branches of Afro-Asiatic. There are now 6 branches: Ongoda, Semitic, Berber, Ancient Egyptian, Cushitic, Chadic, and Semitic. At one time, the Chadic language family was excluded from from Afro-Asiatic because of the way Chadic speakers looked. How could you have these, quote, Negroes, these black people, in a family, linguistic family, where everybody else is light skinned, or, quote, to the minds of certain people, these are white people. So Chadic was said, it can't be a member of this family. It can't be. It can't be. This is what people thought. Even though there have been other scholars, interestingly enough, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, who said, no, these languages seem to be related, Hausa and other Chadic languages. Well, there's an irony here, and the irony is this. The R1 lineage, which is an M89 lineage, if you think back to the tree, comes from the Near East in the current estimations of these things. So it is very interesting and odd that the black members of the Afro-Asiatic families, are the darkest ones, actually are the ones that have the Near Eastern Y chromosome in high frequency, sometimes 95%. So how do we explain that? It's very interesting. Well, you know, is it possible that there were actually people that color living in the Near East? Is it possible that these men came and, just totally got absorbed? I don't believe at all that this haplotype has anything to do with the spread of the Chadic languages. I think the Chadic languages were already there. And in fact, the mitochondrial DNA gives another story for those who use these single systems. One paper attempted to attach them to the Cushitic languages coming from the East, and there's some archaeological data that speak to this. So here you have an interesting irony, an interesting situation that doesn't make sense. Now, there's another historical thing that's interesting about this. There's a German historian who's not well loved because he's a diffusionist, but I'm not going to simply dismiss him because of that. He feels that he has good data or that he's done the correct analysis. And he believes that in the 7th century, with the fall of Assyria, that Assyrian migrants came to the Lake Chad, northern Nigeria region. He believes it seriously, and he publishes his papers. They're published in Nigeria. And he says that studying certain myth cycles, the pre-Islamic things in Nupe and other places, that he thinks he sees a redeployment of Assyrian festivals in African terms. The issue is not whether I believe that or not. The issue is that this is another possible explanation for the presence of these R1 lineages. Now, we could talk about microsatellites and stuff to talk about diversity. That's all well and good. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't work, in my opinion, later. Okay. The summary is this: African peoples can be seen as those who emerged bioculturally in Africa, whose identities were assembled on African soil, whose biology was assembled, irrespective of any foreign influences that may have been brought to bear. Evolutionary factors help explain the biological diversity in the sense that narrow faces and narrow noses can be the product of climatic adaptations to hot, dry climates. This has been shown in terms of correlation studies, and it makes physiological sense. There are historical interactions of known and unknown peoples that have also contributed to African diversity, and critical approaches are needed. And I've been told that I should leave, is that right? I have 3 minutes. Wow, okay. All right, so let's go back to the gallery of Africans. Where's my helper? Okay, let's see. How do you, okay. Well, all right. Well, I'm done. I was going to review, let you see again the diversity after that discussion, to look again at the gallery, my portrait gallery. Oh, wait a minute. Somebody's trying to help me from afar? Is that right? Yeah, these things, okay. Okay, you know, I should be ashamed to admit these things. Okay, all right. So here we have somebody, a Haratine woman. The Haratine live in southern Morocco. Some people say they were original inhabitants of the Sahara Desert in the Holocene, whatever that means. But you have a person from southern Africa who looks very similar in terms of facial features. This is a Berber woman. I forget which group. But, you know, you see the high cheekbones, a particular facial structure. Here's another Berber woman who looks different. Here's another Berber-speaking woman, Tuareg. Here's a woman from Nubia. And here's a woman, you see this old stuff, Nigeria, female, paleo Negro. And you have to be very careful about terminology. Here you see on the side here, drawing from Petrus Camper. Petrus Camper, a Dutch anatomist, inventor of the facial angle, said that, you know, all of the European painters got the 3 wise men wrong. They got the black wise man wrong because they painted him with the European angle to his face. He said because the Africans he had seen had this subnasal projection, but Camper's was wrong. He didn't listen to the other Europeans who've been to other places and seen jet black people who have noble Aryan features and, you know, straight profiles. Okay, here's a person, well, with a profile. Oh, and here's a representation of a person who also prognostic, who's got the stereotypical African trait, the Sphinx. Okay, here's another person. The Shilluk said to have European features. This is very typological in thinking because it assumes that a straight face, a certain architecture, has to be due to admixture. Could not have occurred by evolution on its own. This is wrong. This is wrong. You know, evolutionary factors as well as interactions with other people explain these things. Here's another Berber with so-called Bushman-like features. Here's another Berber. This guy is probably from Algeria in the region, in the Kabylia, as opposed to the other guy who's probably from Morocco. Okay, well, I'm done. I'm just having fun now. I'm done. This is Beja. Thank you. You know, Beja from the Sudan, you know, Somali. Ethiopian Jew here. Okay. Oh, thank you.